Well, let us bring you now more on the situation in Gaza, because more than 100 people are reported to have been killed across Gaza over the last 24 hours as Israel steps up its attacks. So what do we know about those latest Israeli strikes on Gaza? Here's BBC Verify's Merlin Thomas.
Over a 24-hour period, Israel intensified its strikes in Gaza, hitting 2 hospitals as well as Jabalia in the north. Israel says it was conducting strikes against Hamas fighters and infrastructure. We verified the strikes of the 2 hospitals here, the European Hospital and the Nasser Hospital. They're both in southern Gaza. Let's start with the European Hospital, which was hit Tuesday evening local time. Multiple bombs were dropped simultaneously, leaving large plumes of smoke rising from the hospital site. The attack killed and injured dozens of people, according to the Hamas-run Civil Defense Agency. And you can see just how deep the impact of those bombs were in this video. And here's the aftermath, which shows a damaged bus hanging inside a crater. This video was filmed in the hospital's courtyard. In total, we've counted and verified 7 craters around the hospital building, which we've mapped out here. Munitions expert Trevor Ball told BBC Verify that so-called bunker buster bombs were likely used in this strike. These are a type of weapon designed to penetrate underground targets like a tunnel system. Israel has previously used them to kill senior Hezbollah figures, including former leader Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut last year. Now, Israeli media reported that the target of the European hospital strike was senior Hamas figure Mohammed Sinwar, the younger brother of the former Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who was killed by the IDF in October. But the IDF haven't yet commented. Now, Israel says it targeted an underground terrorist infrastructure at the hospital site, but they didn't provide any evidence of this. They did release this video, which they claimed was of the European hospital, but that's incorrect. It's actually a school a few hundred meters away, and we've reached out to the Israeli army for comment about this, but we've not yet heard back. Now, in the early hours of Tuesday morning, the Israeli army also struck another hospital, the Nasser Hospital, with a different munition. We verified this footage of smoke billowing from the 4th floor window of the hospital after the strike. Images like this, shared online, also show substantial damage inside the hospital building. Hassan Asleh, a journalist who has reported extensively from Gaza for many years, was at the hospital receiving treatment at the time of the attack. Verified video of the aftermath confirmed he was killed at the scene. Now, Israel has accused Asleh of direct involvement in the 7th of October attacks. He reported on the assault and shared photos of himself at the scene. Israel strikes have killed around 100 people over a 24-hour period in these 2 hospital strikes, as well as in Jabalia, footage of which you can see here. This comes at a moment when the UN's head of humanitarian affairs has called on world leaders to prevent, in his words, genocide.
Merlin Thomas there from BBC Verify. Benjamin Netanyahu is coming under growing scrutiny from world leaders. The United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Chief urged action to, in his words, prevent genocide in Gaza. In the last few hours, the Israeli Prime Minister accused the French President of siding with a terrorist organisation after Emmanuel Macron criticised Israel's block on aid getting into Gaza. Here's the clip in question.
I saw all the aid that France and so many other countries were delivering to El Arish, which was blocked by the Israelis. And so I say it forcefully. What Benjamin Netanyahu's government is doing today is totally unacceptable. There's no medicine. We can't get the wounded out. Doctors can't get in. And I want to salute the work of the humanitarians that I saw at El Arish, Doctors Without Borders, all our NGOs with the Foreign Ministry Crisis Centre. What he's doing is a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And so we absolutely have to fight to reopen first, because these are lives. Then, yes, we must fight to demilitarize Hamas, free the hostages and build a political solution.
Well, let's speak now to our correspondent in Jerusalem, Wira Davis. And Wira, President Macron there being quite vocal in his criticism of Israel. What's the impact of that and the current scrutiny on Israel?
Look, there's increasing pressure, increasing calls from around the world, from within Israel in part, and parts of the Middle East, for Israel to do two things: to pull back from this huge expansion of its military intervention in Gaza, and also to allow aid in. There's medical aid needed, there's fuel needed, and there are medicines needed, and none of that has got in now for more than 70 days. A variety of organisations across the UN, also the World Health Organization, Oxfam, have all pointed to the acute humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We've seen images coming out of Gaza of people in dire need of food. There isn't quite yet a famine in Gaza, according to a collection of UN bodies, but the situation in the Palestinian enclave is nearing that. Most people in Gaza are suffering from food insecurity. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Now, Israel has justified the blockade and by saying that it has stopped aid getting into Gaza for two reasons. It says it's to try and persuade Hamas to release the remaining hostages. And also Israel has accused Hamas of expropriating, of stealing some of the aid for its own military purposes. But the evidence from the ground would suggest that this blockade has had a huge impact across Gaza. The Israeli former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told the BBC a few minutes ago, it's intolerable, unacceptable and unforgivable. And Mr Olmert also said that a number of former senior Israeli military commanders had warned against this promised expansion of Israel's military operation in Gaza, which would occupy and control much of Gaza and push much of the population southwards as well.
And we are hoping to speak to Ehud Olmert in the next couple of hours or so. This all comes whilst Donald Trump is in the region. Is there any diplomacy on the Gaza-Israel front whilst he's there?
Well, there's a small plan on the table called the Witkoff Plan, which would involve Hamas releasing about half of the remaining live hostages in exchange for an undetermined number of days ceasefire and perhaps more aid getting in. But there are problems from both sides with that Witkoff Plan, as it's being called. The perception is that that plan will be on the table for as long as Donald Trump is in the Middle East. If it isn't agreed by the end of the week, the concern is that that full-scale military operation by Israel will resume again, and the humanitarian consequences are very, very difficult to think about. But that is the one chink at the minute of hope. Donald Trump alluded to that, I think, as he arrived in Qatar today. Mr. Trump is, of course, apparently quite frustrated with the Israeli position. In many ways, of course, Donald Trump, what he's here to do in the Middle East is to sign deals, big multi-million dollar deals, as we've heard. And Donald Trump thinks that the continuation of war and bad relations in the region is not good for business. And Donald Trump, I think, would like to see Israel and Hamas come to an agreement to end the war.
Wira Davis, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get more now on the blockade of aid into Gaza and speak to Michael Fakhri, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. What exactly do you know about whether any aid is getting in? Because Israel has said that some is.
No aid, no food, no water, no humanitarian relief has entered Gaza for over 70 days. And in fact, Israel announced that its intent on the 1st of May. So it announced its intent. And if you ask any UN agency, and if you listen to the Security Council briefing yesterday, it's very clear that nothing has entered Gaza for over 70 days.
And so what is the impact on the people in Gaza now?
Well, let's think about what the situation is before October 2023, in which 50% of people in Gaza were hungry and 80% relied on humanitarian aid. By January of 2025, the International Court of Justice recognized that there was widespread starvation and famine in Gaza. And now the situation is worse than it ever has. So it is clear that famine is spreading quickly across Gaza. This is the fastest famine and the fastest starvation campaign we've seen in modern history.
What do you say, though, to those voices in Israel who say that the aid was being taken by Hamas? Some say that it was then being sold and used for their own military purposes and that they cannot allow that to continue.
There is no excuse and no reason in international law to stop the flow of humanitarian aid to civilians. And what we've seen over the last 19 months by Israel has either blocked aid, it's restricted aid, or when humanitarian convoys have finally made it through, Israel has targeted and attacked UN humanitarian convoys over 10 to 15 times, and this is recorded. So Israel has killed a record number of UN and humanitarian staff, more than any modern war that we've ever seen.
What about this alternative plan that's been suggested for getting aid in, potentially backed by the US?
This was a plan put forward by Israel in April, and every UN humanitarian agency said this was not a humanitarian plan. This was a military plan. This was a cynical plan. This was a plan to corral people, and it contravened every humanitarian principle one can imagine. The US has now taken over this plan, and we have yet to see any difference. So this is not a plan to feed people to stop starvation. This is a plan to corral people into southern Israel and to pick and choose who gets food, which contravenes humanitarian law. So every UN agency, every humanitarian agency, and the consensus on the Security Council is this is not a real plan to help civilians in Gaza.
Michael Fakhri, UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, thank you very much.